How about a scary story? One of the best in the genre. One that has launched a plethora of adaptations and twists. The Monkey's Paw.
Fucked up scary tales with Liz. Ooh.
The year was 1902, and the evening was wet, cold, and stormy. But inside the White family home, all was warm and bright. Mr. White and his grown son Herbert sat puzzling over a game of chess, while Mrs. White knit by the fire. Mr. White lost to his son, but there wasn't that much time to be a sore loser before a knock came at the door. The Whites' anticipated guest. Sergeant Major Morris was an old family friend who'd been deployed for many years in India. After a few tumblers of whiskey, the veteran began to loosen up and regale the family with stories of his time abroad. Mr. White was envious of the experience, and he said so. But Morris told him he was better off being home. "Nonsense," White replied, "with all the sights and sounds and magic and mystery you got to see. For example, that monkey's paw you were telling me about yesterday." Morris clammed up suddenly, but Mrs. White and Herbert were intrigued and pressed the veteran for more info. Reluctantly, Morris pulled from his pocket the small, mummified hand of a monkey, its claw clenched in a tiny fist. The men passed it around, while Mrs. White grimaced. It was hard to tell what could be so special about a battered, odd little object. But a hush came over the room as the sergeant major told them its story. The paw came from an old holy man, who endowed it with a spell. With a curse, really. He wished to illustrate that fate is the ruler of our lives, and that those who seek to control it do so at their own peril. So he magicked it to grant 3 men 3 wishes apiece. Herbert smiled. "Has anyone tried it? What about yourself?" The sergeant major paled. "I have wished upon it. The man who owned it before me did as well. I do not know what his first 2 wishes were, but his 3rd wish was for death." The group stared at the object with wide eyes. "How do you go about it?" Mrs. White asked. "The wishing part, I mean." Morris picked up the paw, studying it. "You simply hold it in your right hand and speak your wish out loud." The man's hand trembled as he held the little paw. Then suddenly he threw it upon the fire with fervor. Mr. White fell after it, snatching up the paw before it could be destroyed. "You're better off letting it burn to dust," the soldier warned him. "But if you want to use it, don't blame me for whatever trouble comes your way." Despite the strange behavior of their visitor, the Whites didn't put too much stock in the story. They laughed about it a bit after their visitor had left. Herbert gestured to his father. "So what are you waiting for? Wish yourself into an emperor, old man." Mr. White hesitated. "I'm not sure what to wish for. I'm very happy with my lot in life already." Herbert shrugged. "Well, the debt on the house has always hung over you. Why don't you wish to clear that? It would be one less burden." Mr. White nodded a bit. It was a sensible wish, after all. He held his right hand aloft. "I wish for $200, he said, blushing and chuckling a bit at how silly it all felt. But his chuckle gave way to a terrified cry. The paw fell from his hand, and Mrs. White and Herbert ran to the old man in alarm. "The thing moved when I wished. It twisted round in my hand like a snake," Mr. White exclaimed. The family was quiet for a moment. Then Herbert broke the silence. "Well, I don't see any money." Mrs. White stroked her husband's back in a calm manner. "You must have imagined it, my dear." The wind whistled over the chimney, and an unsettled feeling came over the family. The typical raps and shudders of an old house in the winter wind made the family jump, and all were only too relieved when their nightcaps were finished, giving them an excuse for an early bedtime. Herbert offered a reassuring joke as his parents got ready for bed. "Looking forward to hearing about that bag full of cash you'll find at the foot of your bed tomorrow. Not to mention the ghoul sitting over you, watching as you slink away with your unearned prize." The next morning, the Whites laughed much more easily at their antics from the night before. In the bright winter sunlight, the monkey's paw seemed shabby and inconsequential. Herbert went off to the factory, and the Whites went about doing their daily chores. Still, when the postman rang that day, Mrs. White met him at the door with an extra pep in her step at the hope of a large check. This made it all the more disappointing when she was presented with a bill from the tailor. Still, she laughed at herself and told her husband of the event over dinner that evening. "I suppose Herbert will have a joke at my expense," she said with a twinkle in her eye. But the twinkle dimmed as she saw a stranger hemming and hawing outside their gate. The man was very well dressed, and kept putting his hand on the gate as if to enter, but then pulling it away. Then suddenly he thrust open the gate and walked purposefully to their front door. Even expecting him, the old couple jumped a bit at his knock. The Whites ushered the gentleman inside, with awkward apologies at the state of their clothes and home. Then a tense silence settled, as the couple waited for the gentleman to tell them his reason for visiting, a reason he didn't seem to want to speak aloud. Finally, the fancy-dressed man took a breath and spoke. "I'm here on behalf of Ma and Meggins," he said. Mrs. White felt a lump in her throat. "The factory? Is it Herbert? What's wrong? What is it?" Mr. White took his wife's hand to calm her, perhaps to calm himself. "No need to jump to conclusions, dear." But the stranger's face was drawn and ashen. "I'm so sorry," he began weakly. Mrs. White interrupted him. "What is it? Has Herbert been hurt?" The gentleman nodded. "Badly. But he is no longer in any pain." For a moment, Mrs. White felt relief. But then the implication was clear. She took in a shuddering breath, and Mr. White clung to her hand tighter. "What happened?" he asked the gentleman. There was a long pause. "He was caught in the machinery." The three of them remained immobile for a moment. The Whites were too much in shock to notice the gentleman shamefully lingering, picking lint off his trousers, until he finally spoke up. "Again, I am so sorry. The firm wished for me to deliver their most sincere sympathies for your loss. And I hope you understand that my next words come to you as a messenger." The old couple watched in bewilderment as the gentleman removed an envelope from his breast pocket. "Ma and Meggins claim no liability in this tragic accident, but in thanks for your son's work this many years, they wish to offer you this sum in condolences." Mr. White dropped his wife's hand, realization creasing his brow. He took the offered envelope and shakily pulled out the monetary note. $200, he read in disbelief. His wife screamed, and Mr. White fainted. Herbert was buried at the cemetery 2 miles up the road. The laughter of the Whites' house was gone now. The brightness dimmed. As the days passed, resigned silence nestled between the old couple. They were often too weary to fill the silence. After all, it was Herbert's good humor that had passed much of the time before, and that presence couldn't be replaced. Despite their weariness, Mrs. White was often awake at night, weeping by the window. Mr. White would beseech her to come back to bed. It was too draughty. But Mrs. White would assert that Herbert was much colder. A week after the burial, Mr. White awoke one night to find his wife standing over him, with a candle in one hand, and her other hand tightly closed in a fist. "Goodness, my dear, what is the matter?" he asked wearily. "I can't believe I didn't think of it," Mrs. White exclaimed. "Why didn't you think of it?" Her eyes were a bit wild. "Of what?" he pressed her. The woman opened her fist, and in her hand lay the decrepit little monkey's paw. "You have 2 wishes left." The old man recoiled away from her. "Wasn't 1 wish more than enough?" he asked fearfully. "No!" his wife insisted. "Please, you have more wishes, and it must be you to wish it. Wish our boy back." The old man grasped her arms and spoke pleadingly. "Please, my dear, you do not know what you ask of me. He's been dead for 10 days. And I didn't tell you this because I couldn't bear to. But when I saw our poor boy, when I saw what the machine had done to him," his hands shook. "My God, I would not have even recognized him if it were not for his clothes." Mrs. White began to grow angry. She pressed the monkey's paw into her husband's hand. "Do you think a mother would fear her own child? Bring our boy back." Mr. White hesitated again, taking in his wife's silhouetted face and her hair haloed against the stark moonlight, and he held the paw up with his right hand. "I wish my son alive again." He dropped the thing as it wrenched in his fist, and he stared at it fearfully. Mrs. White rushed to her chair by the window and watched outside desperately. But time passed, and as the candle burned down and the light flickered out, Mr. White relaxed at last. Perhaps the events of a week before had just been a tragic, cruel coincidence. Perhaps it was he who was thinking too wildly. His wife returned to bed, diminutive in her disappointment. But neither could settle back into sleep. A mouse scuttled in the wall, a shutter creaked, and tension thrummed between them. Eventually, Mr. White got up to replace the candle. He struck a match to light his way down the stairs. At the bottom of the stairwell, his match went out. He pushed open the box to light another. Before he could strike the thing, an almost inaudible knock sounded at the door. Mr. White dropped the box of matches, and they pitter-pattered over the floorboards. He listened. Had he imagined it? A second knock answered him, and a third. "What is that?" Mrs. White had joined him at the top of the stairwell. "Nothing," her husband answered. A rat passed by me on the stairs." He cringed as there was a fourth knock at the door behind him. Mrs. White gasped. "It's Herbert! What are you doing stalling? It's Herbert!" She rushed down the stairs and past him, but her husband held her back. "No! Don't let it in, for God's sake!" he cried. Another knock came, then another, louder and persistent. Mrs. White wrenched herself away. "You would fear your own son," she accused her husband angrily. "I'm coming, Herbert!" She dashed to the door and began pulling at the bottom bolt with trembling fingers. Her husband bolted up the stairs, stumbling. He paid his wife no heed as she called up after him. "Please come back down! The top bolt, I can never reach it!" But Mr. White was back in the bedroom, groping around the floor desperately. The knocking continued, insisting, reverberating through the house. Mr. White gasped and fumbled as he heard the scrape of his wife dragging a chair across the floor to the door. At last his fingers brushed the old monkey's paw. He held it up and frantically hissed his final wish as his wife wrenched open the top bolt. The knocking suddenly ceased. He heard the chair scrape back and the door open. Cold wind rushed up the staircase, causing the bedroom door to shut with a slam. And then there was silence. At last, a long wail carried its way to him. Mrs. White called Herbert's name miserably, with hacking sobs. The old man staggered to his feet and crept downstairs. As he took his wife in his arms, he looked over her shoulder through the open door. The street lamp flickered, and the gate swung slowly. But the road was empty. The Monkey's Paw was written in 1902 by British writer W. W. Jacobs. It has been adapted for the stage and screen many a time. Some consider Stephen King's Pet Sematary to be a version of it. And frankly, even The Simpsons parody gives me the willies, though I fucking love it. I hope you enjoyed it. And be careful what you wish for.